I was afraid to wake him in case he left me. Trembling with fear, I strangled his struggling body. And when he was dead, I took his young body back to bed with me. I had started down the avenue of death and possession of a new kind of flatmate.
Dennis Nilsen spared Karlsdotter, but at least 15 people weren't so lucky. They paid the ultimate price for Dennis Nilsen's hospitality.
Dennis Nilsen's trial in 1983 revealed him to be one of the most ruthless and deliberate multiple murderers in history. After strangling his victims, most of them young homosexuals, Nilsen had ritually washed them, cut up their bodies, and wrapped the remains in plastic bags. These he kept in his wardrobe or hidden under the floorboards. Eventually he would burn the contents in the back garden or flush them down the drains. As the evidence about Nilsen was assembled, the police on the case soon formed a definite view of the man they had arrested.
I spent some 14 hours at Hornsey Police Station interviewing Nilsen. And as a result of that, I considered him one of the most evil people I've ever met. He showed no remorse whatsoever for his actions. Neither did he provide any motive for the killings. And I could find nothing in his background to suggest why he should do it.
After his trial, Dennis Nilsen reflected in his diaries on the causes of his behavior. At times, he accepts the view held by the police and the press.
I'm an irresponsible, selfish bastard who deserves everything that is coming to him. Maybe I was just born an evil man. There is no excuse for taking the lives of 15 innocent people and trying to kill 8 others. The buck stops here.
At other times, Nilsen takes quite the opposite view of his motivation.
I do not feel like an evil person. I believe my offences are motivated by emotional disorders, under unique conditions of extreme mental pressure, which release areas in the subconscious when I have lost control.
These conflicting extracts from Nilsen's diaries show that he regards himself as both responsible for his actions, yet also under compulsion. And this highlights a problem at the heart of all discussions about evil. In last week's program, we saw how this contradiction is typical of the way people describe the conduct that they call evil. Can this paradox be resolved? Today, we shall look closely at the case of Dennis Nilsen to try and answer that question and discover the roots of evil. In 1983, the writer Brian Masters, intrigued by press reports of the Nilsen case, decided to visit Brixton Prison, where Nilsen was held on remand. Masters was determined to produce as comprehensive and accurate a portrait as possible of the mind of a multiple murderer, and it was he who persuaded Nilsen to write about the murders in these diaries.
I first became interested in the Nilsen case in 1983, and since then I've gone into it in some depth. His prison journals, coupled with what I've managed to find out about him, provide one of the most detailed pictures we have of the nature and background of such a man. Nilsen's family came from the fishing villages surrounding Fraserburgh in northeast Scotland. Before he was born, Nilsen's parents had already separated. His mother seemed to be unable to cope with all 3 children, and inevitably, Nilsen's grandparents took some of the responsibility.
I remember being borne aloft on the tall shoulder of my great hero and protector, my grandfather. He would also take me around the harbour, and on board the herring boats. I remember the smell of nets and fishing things.
In time, there grew between Nilsen and his grandfather a bond more precious than any other relationship in the family. Then, one day, the news came in from his crewmates that the grandfather had died. Nilsen was not yet 6.
Why, I thought, should he go to a better place and not take me with him? So death was a nice thing. Then why does it make me miserable?
This event seems to have made quite an impact on Nilsen. He retreated into a fiercely private existence. He became more moody than ever, and the only time he would allow his emotions to be aroused was in reflecting about his grandfather.
On the rocks, I stood gazing at the all-powerful, restless sea. I felt very akin to that great force. We reciprocated in a spiritual affinity of great love and great fear. I would stand for some time with a tear-filled face looking out there for my grandfather to come and comfort me, as he always had.
Nilsen has told me of several other unusual but significant experiences during his childhood. It's hard to say which ones are true, but one of them is about him and his brother when they shared the same bed. One night, when his sexual imagination could no longer be restrained, and waiting till he thought his brother was asleep, Nilsen undid his brother's pyjama cord and began to explore. The body beside him did not move, but remained still, lifeless, he says. Images of death, images of love, were beginning to mingle in his subconscious. At the age of 15, he realized that his sexual preferences were probably homosexual, certainly bisexual.
The novelty of one's own body soon wore off. My imagination hit on the idea of using a mirror. By placing a large, long mirror on its side, strategically beside the bed, I would view my own reclining reflection. At first, always careful not to show my head, because the situation needed that I believe it was someone else. But that play could not be drawn out long enough. The fantasy could dwell much longer on a mirror image which was asleep.
What made Nilsen's fantasy unusual was that the body in the mirror had to be still and the head not visible. In later years, he would put talcum powder on to erase the living color and smear charcoal under his eyes and put pale blue on his lips. Dennis Nilsen was aroused by the image of himself, but of himself only as a dead man. Love and death were becoming dangerously mingled in his mind as the memory of his grandfather surged forward.
The minute you walked in the joint, how many bloody light has been out there?
In 1975, Nilsen met a young man for whom he seems to have developed some affection. He took this home movie in 1976, in the flat where 2 years later he would begin his murderous career. Already, Nilsen comes across as a self-centered and arrogant man.
No, the situation is like this. 1:10 last night, son asleep, twink over there, me here. What happens? Crash, bang, what? Have a look there. Move the counter up there. Have a look at that. Right? Look at the state of that. Whole bloody ceiling falls down. Falls down on me for a start. Rips straight across, hits the dog, poor old pooch. Budgie goes up. Big row. And it wakes you up as well. Okay? Have a look at this. Great chunks. Bloody great chunks of masonry. I mean, you could kill somebody. Listen to that. No.
A year later, however, the relationship comes to a bitter end.
Keep my socks on for a quick getaway.
Nilsen's one attempt at a sustained relationship had failed, and he was left with the conviction that he was probably unfit to live with. He therefore channeled all his affection into caring for Bleep, all his lust into anonymous late-night meetings, and all his self-pity down the neck of a bottle. And then things began to go terribly wrong. His first victim was in 1978, his last in 1983. The pattern in all was the same. Young homosexuals were invited back to his flat. They drank. They listened to music. Sex would only occasionally take place. The victims were then strangled, sometimes drowned as well. Afterwards, he would talk to the body, admire it, caress it. As Nilsen said to me, it was the beginning of the end of my life as I had known it.
I stood in great grief and aware of utter sadness, as if someone very dear to me had just died. I knew I had brought this result, but like life itself, that scene looked right. Like a ritual, the body had to be undressed and washed. I sometimes wonder if anyone cared for me or them. That could easily be me lying there. In fact, a lot of the time it was.
The case of Dennis Nilsen presents a challenge. What could cause a man, apparently sane, to kill in this way? The Radcliffe Observatory at Green College, Oxford, dates from the late 18th century, the time that modern science began to challenge the religious view of the universe. At the same time, scientific method began to be applied to the mysteries of the mind. One scientific explanation of human destructiveness is offered by psychiatry. Dr. Anthony Storr, a fellow of Green College, believes that Nilsen exemplifies a classic personality disorder.
When I first read Brown Masters' book about Nilsen, I felt that here was as intimate and authentic a portrait of this multiple murderer as we're likely to get. Any scientific approach to understanding Nilsen's behavior must include an account of his psychological makeup. Nilsen was not mad in the technical sense, but suffering from what psychiatrists call a schizoid personality disorder. The main abnormality which such people show is a desperate need for love, combined with an equally desperate fear of letting anybody get close to them. If someone's given up all hope of making any permanent loving relationship with another living being, he's likely to have fantasies of an ideal union in death. The only affectionate relationship which Nilsen formed as a child ended in a wrenching disappointment. From then on, he became a loner. He couldn't make close contacts because he feared that any love he might be given would again be taken from him. It is those who feel themselves unwanted who show the greatest hostility to others. Such people compensate for their loveless lives by retreating into fantasy rather than making relationships with real people. Until his mid-20s, Nilsen had no sexual experience in the real world. His life of fantasy, involving mirrors, gave him partial satisfaction for a time, but fantasy is never a total substitute for reality, and we must assume that for years his resentment was gradually increasing. Schizoid personalities can become dangerous if and when their fantasy worlds break down. Nilsen remained reasonably stable so long as his first flatmate stayed with him. After he left, Nilsen was entirely alone and turned to drink and anonymous late-night pickups. He must have felt humiliated, defeated, unloved, and impotent. Killing people became for him a way of re-establishing his identity as someone to be reckoned with. He'd found a way of making young men he desired stay with him, and this is why he kept their corpses in his room. The question is, once feeling under a strong impulse to kill, why did his moral sense not restrain him, as it does in most people who know they should not do what they would like to do? I think the one answer is that Nilsen and people like him fail to develop a moral conscience. The development of conscience depends upon learning early on the standards laid down by parents and others upon whose love and approval we are dependent. It's only gradually, by the development of strong ties of affectionate dependence on those who care for us, that we become able to identify ourselves with our nearest and dearest. A lone wolf for whom nobody cares, himself cares for nobody. For him, other people are merely obstacles in the way of his desires, or else the means to his gratification.
I can't understand you. I ask you to fucking start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go, sit pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like. They're training fucking chimpanzees at Cape Canaveral to operate a camera. Anybody can do it. For crying out loud, switch it down.
When a powerful impulse is combined with an absence of moral conscience, the consequences are likely to be lethal. And once the threshold of the first murder is overcome, subsequent thresholds become easier and easier to cross, almost like an addiction.
To the scientist, then, the causes of evil can be discovered in the inner workings of the mind as it is shaped by heredity and environment. This is a view with profound implications. Because it regards human actions as determined exclusively by genetics and conditioning rather than by choice, it abolishes moral responsibility. How satisfactory is that proposition? Few people would deny that background and environment play an important role in influencing human action. But can freedom of choice be merely an illusion? The idea certainly does not accord with our sense of ourselves as moral agents, with the freedom to decide on the good or evil we would do. Many people will instinctively sympathize with Jeff Chambers, whose interview with Nilsen left him quite certain that he chose to kill his victims.
He was extremely plausible, he was cunning, he was articulate. A measure of his cunning, of course, was the fact that he put tyres on the bonfires at Melrose Avenue, where he disposed of 12 bodies, in order to conceal the smell of the burning flesh. He was also very clever in the way in which he picked up his victims, most of whom he met in pubs in the West End, and he would chat them up and find out what their background was and whether or not they were likely to be reported missing. As far as I'm concerned, he did what he did because he wanted to. No one forced him to do it.
There's a conflict between the evidence of science and that of our own feelings as to what ultimately caused the killings in that top-floor flat in North London. Either we go along with science and accept that human actions, including those of Dennis Nilsen, are the outcome of irresistible forces, or we follow our intuitions and assume that we are indeed all capable of making free choices. The two positions look irreconcilable, but there may be a way to bring them together. The clash between determinism and free will is one of the oldest debates in philosophy. Recently, the philosopher Mary Midgley has suggested a possible solution in the case of evil actions.
On the face of it, free will and determinism seem mutually exclusive. It looks as though we have to take sides. Yet actually, we don't have to make this choice. There's real evidence for both. I think we've got to bring them together somehow. We must try to find a way of combining these two halves of the truth. The main obstacle to combining them is the notion that evil is a clear positive force. We have to grasp instead a more subtle view of evil as negative. Just as darkness is not a positive force, but the absence of light, so evil must be understood as the disastrous absence of vigilance, of attention, of a willingness to think through the consequences of one's actions. Within all of us, there are to a greater or lesser degree many tendencies to destructiveness. Yet, within all of us, as we surely know, is the free will to control these tendencies, if we're sufficiently vigilant. Evil occurs when we choose to relax control. So, when we talk of evil as negative, we're referring to a failure to do something essential inside our own minds. This idea of culpable neglect, of inner emptiness, of a lie in the soul, is actually a very old approach to the problem of human wickedness. From Socrates on, it's been part of the main European philosophic tradition. It has also been an important part of Christianity. Peter Mullen, a vicar from Yorkshire, has looked at this connection.
Christianity teaches us, I think, that we are born, all of us, with an inclination to do good. But we're also born with an inclination to sin, to do individual acts of wickedness. I mean, it may be lust or avarice or any of the 7 deadly sins, you know. And technically, this inclination to sin is called original sin, and it's in all of us, according to the Bible. But worse than the individual pieces of sinfulness, if you like, or the individual naughty acts that we all get up to from time to time, is the refusal within all of us to recognize our own sinfulness, the refusal to recognize our own inclination to sin. And this is the thing that's really destructive, because it means that we don't see ourselves as we really are. And it's the sin of the scribe and the Pharisee in the New Testament, for whom Jesus has the greatest condemnation, you'll remember, because these are the men who think themselves righteous and despise others. These are the people who think that they do no wrong. You know, they give tithes of all they possess. They fast twice in the week. It's a sort of self-righteousness. I suppose you could call it pride. And pride is the sin that caused Satan, Lucifer's downfall, and the sin, of course, which caused the fall of Adam. Religion isn't the only part of human endeavour that has looked at this refusal on our part to recognise our own inclination to sin, of course. The poets and the novelists and the playwrights have done it down the centuries. And in particular, I think, one of the most striking successes is in the work of Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
In the celebrated Hollywood version, guests at a dinner party are discussing Dr. Jekyll's theory concerning an episode earlier in church, when a man seemed to have gone berserk.
I don't mind elaborating. Most of you were in church this morning. If you didn't see that poor chap, you heard him, I'm sure.
Yes, yes. I thank you for your assistance there, Doctor.
Hopelessly insane, obviously. I don't think he was insane. I think there was only one side of him in existence, and that side was expressing itself.
Good heavens, which side?
His evil side.
Evil side?
The man had been spiritually distorted through shock. That explosion in the gas main last month. Before that, he was a fine, solid citizen. Gentle and kind with his children, deeply in love with his wife. Since then, he had undergone a complete change. Until this afternoon, I found him completely reverted to the animal.
But look here, Harry, we can clearly understand a shock to the nervous system, but what's that got to do with the soul?
Well, I think the man had been shocked from normal good into complete evil. Now, when I say he was a good man, I don't mean that he hadn't had a bad thought now and then, or that he hadn't committed ordinary transgressions against society. But after all, that's the problem of civilized man's soul, isn't it? That the good and evil in it are constantly fighting one another?
Stevenson has given Dr. Jekyll a fundamental insight. that there is a shadow or darker side to the soul. The proud and ambitious Dr. Jekyll believes he can use this insight to perfect himself. By transforming himself occasionally into Mr. Hyde, he hopes to give free rein to his sinful impulses, whilst remaining wholly good as Dr. Jekyll. But his plan goes badly wrong. Mr. Hyde becomes an uncontrollable monster. What Stevenson is showing us is the fatal danger of disowning our shadow. The shadow is part of ourselves, and the task is to own up to it and integrate it into the personality.
Tonight on my way to Sir Charles. You see, I thought I could control. But tonight this change, this thing you saw happen.
The problem is that if we don't bring it under control, the shadow is liable to break loose and have a destructive life of its own. Like Dr. Jekyll, Nilsen was too vain and arrogant to admit that there was anything wrong with him. Nilsen may have had a much greater tendency to destructiveness than most people, but it was not irresistible. Nilsen was not an uncontrollable killing machine. The fact that he killed only on some occasions, that he took men home and sometimes began to kill them and then stopped, shows that inside him his will was wrestling with all the pent-up pressures towards killing. The difference between Nilsen and normal people is that much more resolute vigilance would have been required on his part to prevent the disaster that would follow from giving vent to his dark side. In his diaries, Nilsen seems to confirm that this was his own perception of the process.
I wish I was consciously evil, so that at least I could have a God to worship. I led a dual life. One life was constantly pulling against the other. I think that I must have subconsciously wished to be in the tomb with my grandfather. Mine is a disease peculiar to me, which I should have sought to cure or control.
Nilsen's eventual blindness to the claims of others, his selective inattention, is nothing less than the abdication of his will. So Nilsen did have a choice, but his choice wasn't as simple as between killing and not killing. In the first instance, it was between admitting and not admitting that his neurotic impulses could have lethal consequences. Once his will had abdicated, his impulses were effectively given free rein, and the path towards destructiveness did become virtually unstoppable.
Mary Midgley's view of the roots of evil integrates the evidence of science with our intuitions about our nature. But this view, too, has disturbing implications. It suggests that the potential for evil is not limited to a few exceptional individuals, but lies within all of us. Why this should be so, and how easily that potential evil can be aroused, we shall see in Part 2. Evil actions can stem from a failure to monitor inbuilt destructive tendencies. Most people, in most circumstances, keep these tendencies in check by their moral vigilance. But there are circumstances where quite ordinary people choose to relax that vigilance, and by doing so commit evil that in normal life they would find unthinkable. Only in this way can many of the most notorious atrocities of our time be explained. Edward Opton witnessed the Vietnam War as a reporter. On his return to America, he joined the University of California as a psychologist. He began to review events in Vietnam to understand the way ordinary people can behave in extraordinary circumstances.
In December 1969, a series of photographs appeared in Life magazine. They had been taken by Ronald Haberle, an Army photographer.
How many civilians did you actually see shot?
I believe to be about 100. General count, no specific count.
The photos, and others not published, show what happened on March 16, 1968, when a platoon of U.S. Army soldiers, led by a weak and inexperienced officer, Lieutenant William Calley, moved through the hamlet of My Lai. They were supposed to search for Viet Cong soldiers and supplies. They found no Viet Cong. But Lieutenant Calley and his soldiers and another platoon in a nearby hamlet killed about 500 unarmed civilians in a little more than an hour. They lined up large groups of civilians by a ditch and machine-gunned them en masse. They raped some of the women before killing them. Almost all the dead were women, old men, children, and infants. The men who moved into My Lai led an ordinary life before they went into Vietnam. Men like Bob Suvis, who joined the Army at the age of 17.
Well, I was a small arms infantry rifleman, carried an M16. Our orders were to search all the hooches, kill all the animals, stagnate the wells, no survivors. It's a free fire zone. The day before our mission, we had lost 3 people. You know, Sergeant Cox and 2 other of my buddies. And everybody was really, you know, pumped up, you know, depressed with what happened. I think it just motivated them. We continued through the village. I came upon one woman that was shot in the stomach. She was still alive, you know, but I knew she wasn't going to live because her intestines were hanging out. So I shot her, for, you know, to put her out of her misery. The same way the boy that I found was all shot up real bad. I shot him, put him out of his misery.
Sergeant Kenneth Hodges led a squad of soldiers into My Lai.
The orders that I received, along with the other squatters and soldiers of Charlie Company, was that we were going into My Lai, back into Pinkville, and that we were going to settle the score. We could, we're going to seek revenge for our fallen comrades. Our orders were to kill and destroy everything that was in the village. And if there were women and children, that meant that they were destroyed also.
And finally, that's the final shot right there, just before these people were shot. I just turned, started to walk away, and out of the corner of my eye, and I saw these bodies dropping over.
Why did you not take a picture of these people actually being shot?
It was a little too horrible.
You didn't take any pictures of, actual pictures of the Americans shooting these people. Why was that?
That's very debatable. I shot 2 or 3 rows of black and white on Army equipment to turn into our public information office. But yet I do not know what happened to these pictures.
Man's capacity to kill for pleasure, excitement, or revenge normally is inhibited by personal and social constraints. Every normal person can empathize with his fellow humans. It is hard not to. Much of our nonverbal communication serves to evoke sympathy. But in My Lai, these restraining gestures on the part of the villagers failed. One reason is that the Army encouraged officers and soldiers to view the Vietnamese as something less than human.
Oh, at the time, my feelings were there's no such thing as civilians. You know, not during war. There isn't, you know. I've seen too many people shot by what most people call civilians, you know. Women snipers, little kid snipers. You know, so to me, you know, there was no civilians.
I was a door gunner, part of a crew on an OH-23 helicopter, and our job was air support and reconnaissance for ground forces of the 11th Brigade.
When you become calloused to killing, when killing becomes a job, you are not killing people. You are killing, it's a hunting trip. It's sport, it's a blood sport. It's like hunting game, only the game fires back. It's the ultimate hunting experience. And in your own mind, these are not Vietnamese people, they're dinks, they're gooks, they're slopes. There's all sorts of slang, and you use it, and you imprint it in your mind. You're not killing people, you're hunting game.
This process of dehumanization affects almost all soldiers. Yet in Vietnam, there were few, if any, other massacres on the scale of My Lai. So there must have been something more to account for an entire platoons engaging in mass murder. A key factor seems to have been leadership. At My Lai, it was Lieutenant Calley who gave permission for the killings.
I would not say that I was a vicious or a wild type of person. When I went into service, it was indoctrinated into me. It was drilled over and over that you're to receive, obey, and carry out orders as quickly and as efficiently as possible. There was no such thing as being taught as to what an illegal order was and what a legal order was, because all orders that we were, as far as we were concerned, were legal. And if you disobeyed a lawful order, it carried a penalty. If you disobeyed a direct order, it carried an even higher penalty. So training was geared to doing what you were told and ask questions later if you have any. You don't stop in the middle of things to ask any questions.
Look up at me. Look up at me. Recover! That's very good. You didn't move till I gave you the proper command. That's very good.
It's common for soldiers to feel that an obligation to obey orders relieves them of responsibility for their actions. This is a familiar story. But there was, however, another far more insidious process at work in My Lai, a process which made murder much easier. When an individual acts alone, like Dennis Nilsen, the ultimate responsibility falls on him alone. That is one reason why most of us, most of the time, think through the consequences of our actions. But when an individual acts as part of an organization, then his ability to foresee and take responsibility for his actions is dangerously reduced. If everyone involved is partly responsible, then no one is wholly responsible. Not those at the top, not those at the bottom. It is then that the greatest evils flourish. Let's look at one case that highlights this process. Almost everyone has heard of the disastrous escape of poisonous gases at Union Carbide's plant at Bhopal, India. We still don't know the full story behind the event, so it's too early to say where responsibility lies.
Process safety standards were made available to the Indian affiliate, and it was the responsibility of the Indian affiliate to proceed with the acquisition of engineering design specialists who would design the plant.
But Bhopal was not Union Carbide's first industrial disaster. That occurred in the 1930s, when the company bored a tunnel to divert the New River in West Virginia. And we now know more about that thanks to a recent book by the medical historian Martin Cherniak.
Gawley Bridge, West Virginia is named the town of Living Dead. Most of its 1,500 men are victims of silicosis, and hundreds have already died. To change the course of the new river and make it run a power plant to produce low-cost electricity, 2,000 men were hired to tunnel through the hill that rises above the village. In the tunnel, they developed silicosis. Contractors and owners sued for millions, declared they had used every precaution. A victim speaks.
I think I'm very lucky to be alive because most of my friends that I've worked with in the tunnel are dead.
Here are the graves of many workmen who came from other places, were stricken, and buried with only the meagerest identification. Congress, aroused, begins an investigation, instigated by Representative Mark Antonio.
I have introduced a resolution to investigate the greatest industrial catastrophe of the 20th century. 474 men have died, and 1,500 men are doomed to die from silicosis contracted while digging a tunnel in West Virginia. This is murder. Somebody is responsible for this murder, and I intend to find out who is responsible, punish him, and prevent similar catastrophes in the future.
Now, it is possible, even likely, that no Union Carbide executive ordered these events. They only ordered, like any dutiful executives, that expenses be minimized. Their consciences were clear, at least mostly so, and if they had doubts, there was much they could say to themselves and to one another to dispel these misgivings. Mining has always been dangerous. It is not the job of executives to concern themselves with details such as housekeeping in a tunnel. At the lower levels, the foremen probably felt little responsibility for safety. Respirators and water hoses were not in the budget, and foremen are not responsible for budgets. Everyone was insulated from the consequences of his actions by the separation of decision from execution. When an organization has several layers through which information must pass, it is very difficult for information about wrongdoing to reach the top. That same diffusion of responsibility that we saw in Union Carbide operated in Vietnam.
I don't feel responsible at all. I think it's the Army's responsible.
And I say the ultimate responsibility would have led back not just to me or to Kelly or to Captain Medina or to Colonel Barker, who was killed later, or to Colonel Henderson, or to the division commander, but on up to the commander-in-chief of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, even to the president.
I'm sitting on my bunker with 3 of my buddies, drinking from beer. You gotta excuse that. That's our heavy artillery behind us. See?
It is surprisingly easy for people, whether they are soldiers or executives, to find reasons and rationales, to cite pressures and temptations that explain why they feel they had no other choice. Most often, each of the explanations has considerable validity. But it is an illusion that one has no choice. Even at My Lai, where the pressures were very severe indeed, men could choose to participate or to refuse. One group of men from another unit, all of them lower in rank than Lieutenant Calley, actually interfered with the massacre at the risk of their own lives.
At some point, late in the morning, we came back into the village and started seeing people that were wounded and dead. We didn't know what had happened. As far as we knew, there were civilians, and an officer on the ground took prisoners, as far as we could tell, marched them into the ditch, and shot them. There were people dead and dying, piled on top of one another in an irrigation ditch. We witnessed a captain at very close range. We were actually pointing at this woman who needed help. We thought the man and his squad would come over and help this woman. Instead, he turned the woman over with his foot and killed her with a rifle. As a gunner, it was not uncommon to see people die, to see people be shot. But the idea of war is to fight an enemy, an armed enemy. This particular day, the enemy was not in that village. Well, it was difficult to handle. We felt rather helpless because what we were trying to do seemed to be impossible. The pilot of the aircraft, Mr. Thompson, I believe he spotted a bunker with people inside of it hiding from the American forces. We went over and talked to the officer in charge of that particular squad, trying to get the people out of the area. The man on the ground did not want to work with the pilot. His idea of taking care of the people would be to kill them. Mr. Thompson walked right into the bunker, or to the entrance of the bunker himself, and brought the people out, called an aircraft down, loaded the people into the aircraft and removed them from the area, saved their lives.
Even for an experienced soldier accustomed to the horrors of war, the events at My Lai were impossible to rationalize.
At least in my mind, if someone told me to kill someone needlessly, you can always miss. You can fire the weapon, but you don't have to hit the target. I heard that a man, I believe, shot himself in the foot, just in order to be medevaced out of the area. Had wanted nothing to do with it, obviously. Who is hurt in war? Innocent people are hurt in war. Every war. But that day, it was just to see so many people killed in one place in such a short period of time. It's the ultimate sin. It's genocide.
A soldier should have a certain amount of control over a situation. Someone was out of control that day.
It must be apparent that if evil somehow could be totaled up, like a column of numbers, the contributions of pathological individuals, like the mass murderer Nilsen, would be minor. The potential for evil is as universal as the propensity to put one's own interests first. If the pressures are sufficiently intense, if the temptation sufficiently strong, if we are swept along in a group enterprise, or if we are only a cog in a complex organization, many of us, perhaps any of us, could become deeply involved in actions rightly called evil. The alternative view, that the world consists of good people, us, and evil people, them, is ever popular and always mistaken. To recognize that mistake and avoid it is a first step towards resisting evil, but it is not enough.
What are the strategies for confronting and resisting evil? That will be the subject of the final program in this series.
And you can see that final program, Confronting Evil, next Monday at midnight.